Our gospel reading this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew. We're in chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. In my Bible, it's entitled Salt and Light. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. This is the reading of the word of our Lord. You may be seated. Well, we've got a lot of names in the news right now. Gavin Newsom, Henry Kissinger died this week. George Santos seems to be in there a lot. Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis. You've heard all of these names. It's really hard to understand politics sometimes, isn't it? I'm not sure it's even possible to understand, but it's hard. I thought maybe we could break the word down just a little bit and make some sense of it. So the word politics starts with poly, and poly means many. So you've heard the word polygamy, which means many wives, right? Poly, and the second part of it is ticks, which are blood-sucking little beasts. Yeah, it helps us sort out what politics really means, doesn't it? I read this on the internet this week. It says, what would have happened if instead of 3 wise men, there had been 3 wise women? It said they would have asked for directions and arrived on time. Helped deliver the baby, cleaned the stable, made a casserole, brought practical gifts, and there would be peace on earth. I'm trying to buy into that a little bit anyway. Our Advent series this year is called God's Gift for You. So we are in that time of year when we are gifting, and there's people out purchasing gifts, not the men, but the rest of you are out, the women are purchasing gifts. The men will do that on Christmas Eve. We are in a time of gift, and we don't want to forget the gifts that God has given us. One of the gifts that God's given us is called a gift of purpose, a gift of purpose. So if one of the huge questions that we ask is, why am I here? Right? It's one of the big, supposedly unanswerable questions that we have. Why am I here? This passage that I read to you, and I'm going to read it in a different version here in just a moment. This passage that I read to you this morning basically says, here's what I want you to do. This is why you are here. And the answer is spread the news and tell the story. Here is the same passage that I read to you early, only this time it's from the Message. Listen to these words. Let me tell you why you are here. You are here to be salt seasoning. You are here to be light. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket, do you? I'm putting you on a light stand. Now that I've put you there on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. God is basically saying, here's plan A for bringing salt and light into the world. And when you do it, when you bring salt and light into the world, it will be life-altering. It will be eternity-changing. And by the way, there is no plan B. No. That's God's plan. So what does it mean to be salt and light? You know, I was thinking about that. There's times in our life when salt isn't very pleasant. Like if you have a cut, yeah, you're not going to want salt in there, are you? That's going to be painful. And what about coming over the top of the hill when you're driving down the road and all of a sudden those million candle watt lights hit you in the face, right? That's not very pleasant either. So there's times that salt and light aren't very pleasant. And so we as Christians got to be a little concerned about that, because sometimes we do the same thing. Our salt and our light causes pain. It pushes people away. It makes them not want to be drawn to the light. So the first one I've got here is in-your-face Christianity. In-your-face Christianity. One of the ways that I always try to illustrate that is to talk about the guy standing on the corner with the bullhorn. When I was in college, we literally had a guy that stood on the corner with a bullhorn because he thought, apparently, that was a good way to evangelize. People, crossed the street, to avoid him. Yeah, they didn't want to be subjected to the bullhorn Christianity. We have to be careful about that. Christians are told how to. My eyes are not working today. I actually read an article where Christians were told how to mount loudspeakers on top of their cars. These bullhorns that go four ways, so that they could drive down the street, proclaiming the gospel of Christ. I've heard of drive-by shootings, but I guess this would be drive-by shoutings, right? Not a good way for us to sell the message of Christianity. In-your-face Christianity is probably not going to draw people to the light. The second one I've got is holier-than-thou Christians. These are the Christians that are smug, that are self-righteous, that have this us versus them mentality. We look at a person on the street and we immediately make a judgment. This is a hell-bound pagan out there on the side of the street. And we need to protect ourselves from them. Does anybody remember the routine Fat Albert? So when I was a kid, I had a record, an LP, with Bill Cosby on it. And one of my favorite tracks on that LP was Fat Albert. Here comes Fat Albert. Women are snatching their children off of the streets. Bricks are falling out of the side of buildings. Fat Albert. Okay, it was funny, honest. When we look at somebody and make that same judgment, that, here's this pagan, we need to, protect our women from them. We need to snatch our children off the street somehow because they're coming by. There's one thing that people know, whether they're identify themselves as Christians, whether they attend church or not, when they look at you, they know that you do attend church. And one of the things that they have is what I call their hypocrisy radar. They've got their antennas up, They're watching to see if you act like the person that you say you are. And boy, if you don't, they identify that immediately. When we act that way, no one will be drawn to the light. And the third one I have is what I call cosmetic Christianity. The first one was in-your-face Christianity. The second one was holier-than-thou Christians. And the third one is cosmetic Christianity. And that's where our spirituality is only skin deep. We want everyone to know that we're churchgoers. But in our real lives, we're unscrupulous in our businesses. They notice that. We're racist and bigoted. They notice that. We're gossiping about people. They notice that. We're angry. We're immoral. We're unkind. All the people that see those things, it sets off their hypocrisy radar. So, here's what we should be in order to draw people to the light, in order to fulfill our purpose in this world. It's one of God's gifts to us to give us purpose. The first one I call costly Christianity. Costly Christianity attracts folks who have never believed before. Ron was the number 2 man in the most vicious street gang in Chicago. They were called the Bel Airs. Now, Ron was a vicious sociopath. In fact, when he was 8 years old, he tried to kill his mother with a hammer. Yeah, this is not a good guy, right? Ron's best friend was beat up pretty badly by a rival gang in Chicago. And Ron vowed revenge. Now, this guy that beat up his friend was named Gary. He went after Gary in the Ritual Gang, and what he did was he got himself a gun. He hid in a bush outside one of the buildings that he knew this rival gang hung out in, and he waited. And pretty soon 6 guys came out of that building. One of them was Gary, the person who had beat up his friend. And he jumped out of the bushes with his gun, and he shouted, "Bel Airs!" And he pushed the gun into Gary's chest and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. It didn't go off. Suddenly, Ron realizes that he's standing there with 6 enemies and a non-working gun. Well, he points the gun up in the air and pulls the trigger again, and sure enough, it goes off. It fires. And when he does that, the 6 guys all run off. Ron chases Gary down the sidewalk, shooting and shooting and shooting at Gary as he goes, and eventually he hits Gary in the back. Gary falls to the ground, rolls over. Ron puts his knee on Gary's chest, holds the gun in his face, and pulls the trigger. He was out of bullets. Yeah. Again, the gun didn't fire. By this point, Ron could already hear the sirens going off, and he runs. In fact, he finds his girlfriend, and the 2 of them run to Canada, where he gets a job, where he marries his girlfriend. They have a child together. He gets the first job that he's ever had in his life. He's working in a factory. And the interesting thing about this factory that Ron is working in Canada is that he met a group of Christians there who ended up being salt and light to Ron. Eventually, their witness was so powerful that Ron fell to his knees and he accepted Christ as his Lord and Savior. Ron started going to church. And eventually, after several years in Canada, his wife and his daughter, Olivia, moved to the Portland, Oregon area. Now, it turns out that Ron could have lived there for the rest of his life because by this time, nobody in Chicago remembered Ron at all. But there was a warrant out for his arrest for attempted murder. Ron was horribly conflicted because he had this new life now. He was a new person. He was born again. He was living the life of a good person. He was paying his taxes. He was holding a job. He was taking care of his wife and daughter. A completely different lifestyle than he had ever had in Chicago. And finally, he decided that he needed to go back to Chicago and face the charges that were being held against him. It was the only thing he could do to make his new faith real. And he did. He went back to Chicago and he stood before the judge. And the judge knew that for the past decade, Ron had completely changed his life. And so the judge gave Ron probation, allowed him to go back to Portland and rejoin his family. Ron took a huge risk, didn't he? To live out his faith. That's what I call costly Christianity. That's not a wishy-washy Christian. That's a Christian who lives out his faith and tries to do what is right. By the way, Ron is now a pastor after going to school in Portland, Oregon. The first one is, if we're going to be true Christians, it has to be a costly Christianity to live out our faith. The second one is compassionate Christianity. We have to be compassionate in order to attract other people to the light. When my daughter was born, I was serving in the Air Force in Germany. She was born 5 weeks premature. She weighed 4 pounds and 7 ounces. We weren't expecting her, obviously, quite that early. And she was born with issues. She was born in the Army Hospital in Landstuhl, Germany. And when she was born, they didn't have a NICU. In fact, I don't think it had been invented yet, This was 70... Oh dear, when was she born? 76, I think. 76. So they didn't even have what we called an incubator at the time. They took some plastic sheeting, some Visqueen, and they draped it over her bassinet, and they punched a hole in it and taped an oxygen line into it, and they put a heat lamp on her. And that was all they could do for her. They tried to get the mucus out of her air passages so she could breathe, but the end of the little suction bulb that they had was bigger than Kessie's entire nose, They couldn't make it work. Kessie fought so hard for a breath that she bounced and bounced on the table like a fish out of water. Now, I wasn't supposed to see any of that. No, that was all supposed to be hidden from me. But the draperies in the that went across the windows from the hallway into the nursery in the hospital had been taken down to be cleaned. And so I had a 24/7 view inside there and could see everything that was happening with Kessie. I had a friend. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anybody to turn to. My parents were in the U.S. They weren't going to be any support. I didn't have anyone else there particularly, but I did have one good friend. His name was David. And I called David and told him what was going on. And David asked his commander if he could take off to go to the hospital and be with me. And his commander gave him permission. And he came to me. And David was a Christian. And he prayed with me. And he sat with me. And he encouraged me. And somehow, David helped me get through what was an incredibly difficult time. Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds. And that is what David did for me that day. The third point I've got here I call consistent Christianity. Linda and Jerry were real people, real Christians. That radar I talked about, they never set off anybody's radar. They lived in an apartment building, and they welcomed every new neighbor to the building that moved in. They cried in compassion with others that were going through a hard time. They prayed over hurting friends. They weren't perfect, but they were genuine. They were living out their faith the best they could. They were consistent Christians. And the fourth and final one that I have is called committed Christianity. So here's just the repeat of the four. The first one is costly Christianity. The second one is compassionate Christianity, consistent Christianity, and this one is called committed Christianity. Leslie prayed. She prayed. You see, she's the wife of Lee Strobel. Anybody know that name, Lee Strobel? Lee Strobel wrote a series of books. The first one was called The Case for Christ. He was a lawyer. And Lee Strobel was an atheist. And he was the most vocal, the most outgoing, the most obnoxious, I shouldn't say it that way, atheist you'll find. He absolutely did not believe in God. He had several good points to make of why he didn't believe in God, and there was no way anyone was going to convince him to believe in God. And Leslie prayed, his wife, because Leslie had been invited to a church group, and Leslie had found Christ. And Leslie said to her friends, what am I going to do? Because Lee is never going to accept this from me. Ezekiel 39:26. Moreover, I will give you a new heart. I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove your heart of stone, and I will give you a heart of flesh. Lee Strobel became one of the pastors at Saddleback Church. That's the church that Rick Warren founded, you may remember. Be savory salt and illuminating light. You do it by being a costly, compassionate, consistent, and committed Christian. And when you do that, you'll be fulfilling your purpose. God bless.